They say a father's greatest asset is watching his child grow into a good person. But last Thanksgiving, when my own son stood in front of 50 elite investors and called me out loud, in front of everyone, a gutless old man who's outlived his usefulness, I understood that the only asset I had left was the truth. Dean stood there under the crystal chandeliers, champagne glass lifted, chest puffed out, announcing his $50 million mega project and the underground foundation technology he proudly called his own invention. The crowd applauded without pause, marveling at the vision of their brilliant young CEO. Not one person in that glittering room, not even my son, drunk on his own power, knew that the blueprint glowing on the screen behind him had been stolen from the safe in my office exactly 3 days earlier. He walked over to me, pressed a glass of ice-cold champagne into the hand of the father still wearing his one worn-out suit, and murmured with a smirk, "Learn to accept it, old man. Your time is over." I didn't get angry. I quietly tightened my grip on a crumpled envelope buried deep in my breast pocket. That envelope held what I called my final test. I had told myself that if, just once tonight, Dean looked at me with even half the respect a son owes a father, I would pull it out and save his collapsing empire. But instead I smiled, clinked my glass against his, and let myself fade back into the shadows. I decided to let him sign that multi-million-dollar contract with all the confidence in the world, because Dean had no idea of one fatal fact. For this project to receive its funding, that stolen blueprint would first have to pass the most rigorous review board in the state, the Office of the Chief Structural Reviewer for the State Urban Planning Commission. And what my genius son could never have imagined. If this story is landing for you, hit like and subscribe before we go further. It helps this channel keep telling stories like mine. Now let me take you back to where it all began. Not that night, but 30 years of silence before it. My name is Harold Whitfield. I am 65 years old. For 31 years, I built Whitfield Heritage Group from a 2-man surveying crew working out of a rusted pickup truck into one of the most respected structural, engineering, and restoration firms in Chicago. We didn't just pour concrete. We saved old libraries from collapse, reinforced century-old rail stations, and turned condemned theaters back into places where people could sit safely in the dark and watch the world unfold on stage. Every beam we set, I signed my name to, not for glory, because if something failed, I wanted to be the one who answered for it. I raised Dean the same way I approached a blueprint, patiently, methodically, checking my own work twice before I trusted it. His mother, Marion, used to tell me I treated our son like a load-bearing wall, always testing how much weight he could take before I added more. She wasn't entirely wrong. I wanted him strong. I wanted him honest. Somewhere between his engineering degree and his MBA, I stopped noticing that the boy I had raised to value integrity had started valuing only the appearance of it. 3 years ago, I handed the CEO title to my son and quietly stepped back into a role he assumed was retirement. He called me a consultant. He meant it as a courtesy title, the kind you give an old dog so he doesn't feel put out to pasture. What Dean did not know, what almost no one outside a small circle of state officials knew, was that I had not retired at all. I had accepted a position most people in my industry spend a lifetime chasing, and few are ever offered: Senior Independent Reviewer for the State Urban Planning Commission, the body with final authority over whether the state's largest construction projects were safe enough to break ground. I kept it quiet because I did not want my son's success, or his failures, tied to my judgment. I wanted him to build something that was his. I did not yet understand how far he was willing to go to make that happen. The Thanksgiving party was held at Dean's new mansion in Lake Forest, a house so large it seemed to apologize for nothing. Real estate elite, private equity partners, city officials who owed somebody a favor. They filled the ballroom in tailored suits and diamond cufflinks, balancing champagne flutes and rehearsed laughter. I sat near the far end of the long table in my old gray vest, the one with the frayed cuff Marion used to mend by hand before the cancer took her, 8 years back now. I did not need a new suit to remind me who I was. What none of those guests understood, gliding through the ballroom with their canapes and their compliments, was that Whitfield Heritage Group was dying from the inside. Dean had spent the better part of a year quietly maneuvering to sell the company to a venture fund called Ridgeline Capital Partners, chasing a personal payout large enough to set him up for life, while the men and women who had worked 20 and 30 years restoring this city's bones would be left holding nothing but a pink slip and a company holiday card. Men like Otis, our old foreman, who had shaped rebar with his own hands for a library, Dean now called a legacy asset in his investor decks. Dean had stopped seeing employees. He only saw line items. I carried the approval file in my jacket pocket that night, the same way I had carried it for 2 weeks, taking it out at my kitchen table each evening and putting it back untouched. Inside it was a preliminary sign-off on the safety review for Dean's underground foundation project, the one piece of paper that could keep Ridgeline's money flowing and buy the company, and every employee in it, the time it desperately needed. I had made myself a private promise. If tonight, just once, my son looked at me not as a name to trot out for investors, not as a prop, meant to lend the family legacy a little gravity, but as his father, if he pulled me aside and asked for my advice with anything resembling honesty, I would sign that file myself before I left the house. I had written that promise to myself on a legal pad 2 weeks earlier, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold beside me. It felt almost absurd, a 65-year-old man drafting terms and conditions for his own forgiveness. But grief makes engineers of us all. We build structures to hold the things we can't say out loud. I told myself the test was fair. I was not asking Dean to apologize for every slight of the last decade, not asking him to remember his mother's birthday or call me on Sundays the way he used to before the company swallowed him whole. I was only asking for one honest minute, one moment where he looked at me and saw his father instead of a name on a letterhead. I watched him work the room instead, watched him introduce me to a hedge fund manager as my father who used to run things around here, the word used to landing with the precision of a man who had rehearsed it. Watched him steer conversations away from me the moment they lingered too long, the way you'd steer a guest away from a stain on the carpet. I told myself it was nerves. I told myself a great many things that night, the way fathers do when they are still hoping to be wrong about their sons. Then Dean raised his glass. The room quieted the way rooms do when a host wants an audience. He looked directly at me, not warmly, not even cruelly at first, just with the flat confidence of a man who has stopped being afraid of disappointing someone. "My father," he said, loud enough to carry to the kitchen staff, "spent 30 years building a company so small most of you had never heard of it before tonight, because he was too gutless to ever swing big. Tonight, I'm going to show all of you what real business looks like." The laughter came fast, the kind that ripples through a room before people even decide whether something was funny. A woman near the bar covered her mouth. Someone clinked a fork against a glass in mock applause. My son smiled at his own joke like a man who had just landed the punchline of his life. I set my champagne glass down on the table without a sound. I did not look away from him. I let my fingers find the edge of the envelope in my breast pocket, feeling the crease of the folded pages beneath the fabric. My chest ached in a way no engineering training had ever prepared me for. 31 years of load calculations, stress reports, and safety margins had never once taught me how to absorb this particular weight, my own son in front of 50 strangers deciding I was something to be stepped over on his way up. But somewhere underneath that ache, the part of me that had spent 3 decades reading blueprints for hairline flaws went very still, very clear, the way it always did in the seconds before a structure either held or gave way. The test was over. My son had answered it for me. I did not say a word. I picked my glass back up, walked toward him through the parting crowd, and raised it in return, as if toasting his triumph along with everyone else. Dean grinned, satisfied, already turning to the next investor's outstretched hand. He had no idea that the man he had just humiliated in front of 50 strangers held in that quiet envelope the single signature his entire $50 million future depended on, and had just decided, with a stillness only true grief can produce, not to give it to him yet. Because there was something else in that ballroom Dean did not know, something far more dangerous to him than a father's wounded pride. He did not know that the blueprint his engineers had projected onto the screen behind him 20 minutes earlier, the foundation design he was about to describe to Ridgeline's partners as his own, had come out of a locked drawer in my home office, a drawer only 2 people in the world had a key to, and I was one of them. I finished my champagne slowly, watching the party swirl past me, the laughter, the handshakes, the easy promises men make each other when there is money on the table. Somewhere in that room, a piece of paper with my signature on it was about to decide whether my son's empire lived or died, and he still believed the only power left in my hands was an old man's pride. He was about to learn otherwise. The dinner moved into the presentation the way these evenings always do. Dessert plates cleared, waiters refilling glasses, and a projector screen lowering from the ceiling at the far end of the ballroom, like a curtain about to rise on the main event. Dean stepped up in front of it, tapping a small remote against his palm, practically vibrating with the kind of energy I hadn't seen in him since he was 9 years old, showing me a science fair volcano he'd built entirely by himself, or so he'd claimed at the time. "What you're about to see," he announced, "is the technology that's going to make the Oakmere Terminal project the safest, most advanced underground development in the Midwest." He clicked the remote. A schematic filled the screen, a cross-section of vibration-dampening foundation piles, load distribution curves, a lattice of reinforced columns designed to isolate a structure from subterranean rail vibration without sacrificing an inch of usable space above it. Investors leaned forward. A woman near the front took out her phone to photograph the slide. I recognized every line of it before Dean finished his second sentence. I recognized the handwriting in the margin notes, even though someone had stripped my name out before printing the investor copy. I recognized the small chip in the corner of the third diagram, a printing flaw from my home office laser printer that had been misfeeding paper for 2 years and that I had never bothered to fix, because I liked knowing which pages had come off my machine and which hadn't. I recognized the coffee ring, faint but unmistakable, in the lower right margin of the load distribution chart, the one I remembered leaving there myself at 2 a.m, 6 weeks earlier. "I personally directed this design," Dean said, his voice climbing with pride, gesturing at the screen like a man unveiling a monument to himself. 5 years of R&D distilled into a system that's going to redefine what we can build on compromised ground. This is the future of Whitfield Heritage. The room applauded. Someone from Ridgeline leaned toward his partner and murmured something about innovation and generational leadership. Another guest asked whether the technology was patentable yet, and Dean said, without missing a beat, that the paperwork was already in motion. I felt something in my chest go very quiet and very still. I stood up. I want to be honest about what that moment felt like, because I think people imagine rage in scenes like this, and rage was not what I felt. What I felt was the same steady clarity I'd feel walking a job site before a pour, checking rebar spacing against a stamped drawing. Something didn't match the paperwork. And when something doesn't match the paperwork, you don't raise your voice. You point at the discrepancy, and you let the discrepancy speak for itself. I walked to the front of the room. Dean's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. Not fear yet, just surprise, the way a man looks when a piece of furniture he forgot he owned suddenly moves on its own. "May I?" I asked, and took the remote from his hand before he could answer. I clicked back to the third diagram, the one with the small printing chip and the coffee ring in the corner. "This isn't your design, Dean," I kept my voice level, the way I'd talk a nervous apprentice through his first structural inspection. This is a vibration isolation pile system I've been developing for 5 years on my own time, in my own office. The load calculations on this page are dated. They're dated because I run new stress models on it every few months, and every version is saved with a timestamp on my private server. I can pull that server log up right now on my phone if anyone in this room wants to see it. I pointed to the margin. This handwriting is mine. I know it's mine because I wrote it 11 days ago, sitting at my own desk, the night after I ran the failure point simulation on iteration 6. A murmur moved through the room, the particular kind of murmur that happens when 50 people simultaneously realize they are watching something they were not supposed to see. Somewhere near the back, a man lowered his phone slowly, no longer filming the presentation as spectacle, but as evidence. "That's," Dean started, and I watched him search for a foothold, the practiced charm draining out of his voice syllable by syllable. "That's family intellectual property. Whitfield has always operated as one company. What's yours is the firm's, and what's the firm's is mine to present to investors." "I never gave you access to that drawer," I said. "I never authorized this design to leave my office, let alone be presented to a room full of strangers as your original work. Someone went into my home study while I was in Springfield for a commission hearing 3 weeks ago. Someone knew the drawer combination because they watched me use it 100 times as a boy, standing in the doorway of my study in his socks, asking if he could help. Someone printed these pages on my printer because only my printer makes that chip in the corner, and then carefully removed my name from every single page before it went into tonight's deck." Dean's jaw tightened. For the first time all night, I watched something crack behind his eyes. Not guilt yet, but the recognition of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't like the answer to. "Everything in this house is family property," he said again, quieter now, aiming the words less at me and more at the investors still watching, as though repetition alone might rebuild the wall between us that had just come down. "You can't seriously be doing this here, in front of everyone. This isn't the place." "I can," I said, "because you chose this exact room to do it in first." I reached into my breast pocket and drew out a second envelope, one separate from the approval file I'd carried all evening, a document I had picked up from my own office that very afternoon, the moment I'd learned exactly what was scheduled to be presented tonight. I unfolded it slowly enough for the several phones now quietly recording to catch every second of it. "This is a formal notice from the Office of the Chief Structural Reviewer, State Urban Planning Commission," I read aloud, steady, unhurried. "It concerns iteration 4 of a vibration-dampening pile system, submitted under a preliminary technical inquiry 3 weeks ago. The notice states that iteration 4 contains a critical load-bearing defect under sustained lateral stress exceeding 4.2 magnitude equivalent, a defect that, under real-world conditions, could result in catastrophic foundation failure beneath an occupied structure." The room had gone from murmuring to fully, uncomfortably silent. "Dean," I said, "the version projected on that screen behind you right now is iteration 4. Not the current corrected version sitting on my server. The flawed one. The one I flagged for revision before it ever left my office, and the one your investors are about to fund with $50 million. Dean's face had gone the color of drywall. "How would you even know that specific detail?" he said. And then, before the sentence finished leaving his mouth, I watched him understand. I watched the realization move across his face the way a hairline crack moves across glass under pressure, slow at first, then all at once. "There are 2 things you don't know tonight, son," I said. And for the first time all evening, my voice was not entirely level. It was quiet, and it was breaking at the edges, and I let it break, because some truths deserve to cost you something in the saying. The first is that the blueprint you just stole from your own father is structurally unsound. The second is that the man Ridgeline Capital hired, independently, months ago, to review and personally certify every technical submission on this project before a single dollar changes hands is me. You didn't just steal from your father tonight, Dean. You just stood in front of 50 investors and submitted a defective, falsified design to the one reviewer in this entire state you could never buy, never intimidate, and never fool. No one in that room moved. Somewhere behind me, a champagne flute, set down too hard, clinked against a plate, and the sound seemed to travel the length of the table like a shot. I did not look at the investors to see their faces change, though I could feel it happening, the way you feel weather shifting before a storm actually breaks. I kept my eyes on my son, watching 32 years of careful posture collapse in front of the very people he'd built that posture for. For a long moment, Dean simply stood there, the remote still loose in his hand, staring at the notice as if he could will the ink off the page by refusing to blink. I watched the color drain out of him in stages. First his face, then, oddly, his shoulders, which had been squared and proud all evening, and now folded inward like a man trying to make himself smaller than the room had suddenly decided he was. The investors did not wait for him to recover. I watched a partner from Ridgeline Capital lean toward the man beside him and say something too quiet for me to hear, but I didn't need to hear it. I'd spent 31 years in rooms like this one, pitching engineering firms to skeptical clients, watching men in expensive suits decide, in real time, whether to trust me with their money. I knew the sound of money deciding to leave before it says so out loud. Chairs shifting an inch back from the table, napkins folded with unnecessary precision, a certain studied interest in the middle distance, phones checked for messages that hadn't actually arrived. "This is a misunderstanding," Dean said finally, though his voice had lost every trace of the confidence it carried 20 minutes earlier. "My father is—" He's exaggerating a technical footnote. Iteration 4 was never meant to be final. This happens in every R&D pipeline. Ask anyone in this industry. I would be happy for anyone in this room to ask the State Urban Planning Commission directly, I said. My review is a matter of public record as of 9 o'clock this morning. You can request it under the state's open records statute by tomorrow afternoon, and I'd encourage you to. That was when Dean stopped performing for the investors and turned fully toward me instead. And for the first time all night, I saw something other than contempt on his face. I saw fear, real fear, the kind I hadn't seen in him since he was 7 years old, and thought he'd broken something in my workshop he couldn't fix, standing in the doorway with sawdust on his sneakers, waiting to see how angry I'd be. "Dad," his voice dropped, low enough that only the people closest to us could hear it. "If you report this, actually report it, formally, you understand what happens to me. Wire fraud, securities misrepresentation, I could go to prison. Is that what you want? You want to be the father who destroyed his own son, in front of everyone, at Thanksgiving?" I have thought about that question many times since that night, turning it over the way you'd turn over a stone to see what's living underneath it. He did not ask whether he had done something wrong. He did not ask what he could do to make it right. He did not ask about the workers, or the subcontractors, or the families whose paychecks depended on a foundation that could fail. He asked what I wanted, as though the consequences of his own choices were a decision I was making, rather than one he had already made for both of us 3 weeks earlier, alone, in the dark, in my study. "I'm not the one who's going to destroy you, Dean," I said. "Your own greed did that 3 weeks ago, the night you broke into my study. I spent 31 years teaching you how to build foundations that hold. I taught you that every load has to go somewhere, that nothing stands on a lie for long, that the ground always tells the truth eventually, whether or not you want to hear it. You didn't build on that ground. You built your entire empire on sand, and you dressed it up in glass and steel so no one would notice until it was far too late." I paused, letting the silence hold the way I'd let a beam settle before adding weight to it. "My job tonight isn't to protect you from what you did. It's to make sure your sand doesn't collapse on top of people who had nothing to do with any of this. The construction crews on Oakmere, The subcontractors who already poured foundation work based on drawings they believed were sound. 43 families who work for this company and never asked to be part of your gamble. I will not let innocent people stand under a structure I know is compromised, not even to save you." Dean opened his mouth to answer and found, I think, that he didn't have one. Something had shifted in his face, not remorse, not yet, but the dawning understanding that the room he'd built to showcase his triumph had just become the room that watched his collapse instead. The investors did not linger for dessert. Within 20 minutes, the Ridgeline partners had made their apologies to the host. Brief, formal, already halfway to the door before they finished the sentence, and the ballroom that had been filled with laughter an hour earlier emptied out in a slow, deliberate exodus. Coats retrieved, cars called, that particular hush of people trying not to look like they're fleeing a burning building while absolutely, unmistakably fleeing a burning building. Dean did not chase after them. He stood frozen by the projector screen, the blueprint of his stolen, defective foundation still glowing behind him, illuminating a ballroom that was now nearly empty except for caterers quietly boxing up untouched food. I did not stay to watch the rest. I left through the side door, past staff already clearing tables, and drove home in silence, the radio off, my hands steady on the wheel in a way the rest of me was not. The formal letter arrived at Whitfield Heritage Group's offices the following morning, hand-delivered before 9. I did not write it. I did not need to. Ridgeline Capital's legal team drafted 11 pages, citing material misrepresentation, undisclosed structural risk, and breach of the technical warranties Dean had personally signed 3 weeks earlier. Warranties that stated, in writing, that all submitted designs were original, independently verified, and free of known defects. The acquisition was terminated, effective immediately. All associated funding, including a bridge loan Dean had already begun drawing against to cover that month's payroll, was frozen pending review. What I hadn't known, what none of us had known, not even Dean's own CFO, a young man named Trevor, who called me himself that same afternoon, his voice shaking, was how much of the company Dean had quietly mortgaged in anticipation of that money arriving. He had used Whitfield Heritage's equipment, its accounts receivable, and even a portion of the employee pension trust as collateral against short-term loans meant to bridge the gap until Ridgeline's capital landed. Now that capital wasn't coming. The debts remained, and they were due immediately, callable, the moment the acquisition fell through. Within 72 hours, Whitfield Heritage Group, the company I had built with my own hands, welded and poured and signed for over 3 decades, was staring down a liquidity crisis that could swallow it whole within the month. I sat in my kitchen that Sunday morning, the same table where I had written my final test on a legal pad 2 weeks earlier, and read through the creditor notices Trevor forwarded to me, I suspect without Dean's knowledge or approval. Payroll obligations for 43 employees, due in 9 days. Subcontractor invoices 90 days past due, with 2 lawsuits already threatened. A pension trust with a hole in it I hadn't authorized and hadn't known existed until that morning. My son had not built an empire. He had built a house of cards on top of the one thing I had spent my life making solid. And now the whole structure was coming down, exactly the way I had warned him it would, on the exact ground he had chosen to build it on. I called Trevor back that afternoon and asked him to send me everything, every loan document, every guarantee, every line of collateral. Dean had signed away without telling a soul. Not because I intended to rescue the company on my son's terms. I already suspected, sitting there with cold coffee going colder in front of me, that rescuing it on his terms was the one thing I could not do. But I needed to understand exactly how deep the hole went before I could decide what, if anything, could still be saved, and for whom. Somewhere in that stack of documents were 43 names that mattered more to me than the name on the building's front door ever had. Dean showed up at my house 4 days later, unannounced, carrying a leather portfolio and the particular brightness of a man who has rehearsed a pitch in his car before ringing the doorbell. I let him in because he was still my son, whatever else he had become in the last week, and because some habits of fatherhood outlast even betrayal, at least long enough to open a door. He laid the contract out on my kitchen table, the same table where I'd read the creditor notices, the same table where I'd written my final test 2 weeks before that, and walked me through it with the polish of a man selling a timeshare to strangers at a resort. He wanted me to liquidate my retirement accounts, nearly everything Marion and I had spent 4 decades setting aside between commissions and careful years of saving, and inject it directly into Whitfield Heritage as emergency capital to cover the frozen bridge loan and stop the creditor calls. In exchange, he was prepared to offer me the title of honorary chairman, a seat on the letterhead, my name back on the door, in smaller print, beneath his. "You'd still be involved," he said, sliding a pen across the table toward me, the same confident gesture I remembered from 1,000 old negotiations with subcontractors, except this time the confidence didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just not in the day-to-day. I'd still run operations, still make the calls. But everyone would know you're still part of this. It's a good deal, Dad. It saves the company. Isn't that what you want?" I read the whole contract twice before I answered him, not because I needed to. The shape of it was clear after the first page, a rescue built entirely around preserving Dean's control while transferring every ounce of the risk onto me. But because I wanted him to sit in that silence and understand I was taking it seriously, even as I was deciding against it. "This isn't a rescue plan, Dean," I said finally. "It's a transfer. You want my money to cover your debts, and in exchange, you want to keep every ounce of control that got us here in the first place. You didn't come here to fix what happened. You came here to buy yourself more time, to keep doing exactly what you were already doing, only with my savings underneath you this time, instead of a stolen blueprint." His face changed the way it had changed at the party, the charm sliding off in real time, something raw showing underneath it. "So what? You're just going to let it collapse? 43 people lose their jobs because you want to punish me for one mistake? I'm not going to let it collapse," I said. "I'm going to make sure it doesn't collapse on the people who had nothing to do with your choices. That's a very different thing from saving your version of it, and I think you know that, even if you don't want to hear it right now." I didn't sign his contract. Instead, the following week, I filed a petition with the bankruptcy court on behalf of Whitfield Heritage Group, placing the company into Chapter 11 reorganization, a court-supervised process designed to protect a business's assets, its contracts, and above all, its workers, while its debts are restructured, rather than letting creditors seize everything piecemeal in a panic. Dean called me that night, and the next morning, and the morning after that, and by the third call, he had stopped asking me to reconsider and started screaming instead that I was a cold, heartless old man, that I had waited my whole life for an excuse to tear him down, that I would rather bury the family name than watch him succeed. I let him say all of it. I did not hang up on him. I have found over 65 years that a man in genuine pain needs somewhere to put the noise before he can hear anything else, and I owed him at least that much of my patience, even if I owed him nothing else after that night at the mansion. What I did not tell Dean, what I had already begun doing quietly, in the background, while he was still drafting his contract at his own kitchen table, was that I had spent the better part of 2 weeks meeting privately with our bank's commercial lending officer and with the local chapter of the Iron Workers and Carpenters Union that represented most of Whitfield Heritage's skilled trades. I proposed something the bank had never financed before, at least not for a company our size, converting Whitfield Heritage's restoration division into an employee-owned worker cooperative, purchased out of bankruptcy by the very people who had built its reputation with their own hands. Not investors, not a private equity buyer looking to strip the company for parts and sell off the name. The actual carpenters, engineers, and site foremen, men and women like Otis, our old foreman, who had shaped rebar with his bare hands for 3 decades and never once seen his name on a single deck of investor slides, would have the first right to purchase the company's operating assets through the court at a fair, independently appraised price, with financing structured to keep the doors open. I put up a personal guarantee to the bank to make it possible. Not a loan to Dean, not a bailout of his failed acquisition, but a direct guarantee behind the workers themselves, structured so that the cooperative and not any single individual held the risk and the reward together. It was, by any conventional measure, a foolish use of a 65-year-old man's retirement security. Marion would have called it exactly the kind of decision I always made, the kind she used to tease me about over coffee, betting on the people doing the actual work over the people signing the checks upstairs. The bankruptcy court approved the sale 11 weeks later. 36 of Whitfield Heritage's 43 employees became founding members of what we would come to call the Restoration Cooperative, each holding a real stake in a company they had spent decades building for someone else's name on the letterhead. Dean was not one of them, as the court proceeding made explicit, and as I insisted on personally during the hearing. Any individual under active investigation for material misrepresentation connected to the underlying dissolution was barred from taking an ownership or executive role in the successor entity. My son, who had spent 3 years believing Whitfield Heritage belonged to him by inheritance, watched a courtroom formally decide it never had and never would again. The Whitfield name came down from the building the following month. I stood across the street and watched 2 workers on a lift unbolt the brass letters, one by one, WHITFIELD, and lower them to the ground on a canvas tarp. It should have felt like losing something, and in some ways it did. But what replaced it, a simple new sign still being designed that week, meant to honor the trades that had actually kept the doors open all these years, felt like the truest inheritance I had left to give. Not a name, not a title, just the chance for the people who built it, brick and beam and long hours, to finally own what they had already spent their lives building. Otis found me there, still watching the empty space where our name used to be, and stood beside me without saying anything for a long while. Finally he said, "Feels strange, doesn't it? 30 years and it comes down in an afternoon." I told him it wasn't coming down. It was just changing shape, the way a building does when you strip it back to the load-bearing walls to find out what was actually holding it up all along. He laughed at that, the way he always laughed at my engineering metaphors, and told me the crew had already voted on a name for the new sign. They wanted to call it Iron Bridge. For the old rail bridge, our very first contract 3 decades ago had reinforced when nobody else in the city would touch it. I told him I thought that was exactly right. Some things deserve to be remembered for what they held up, not for whose name was bolted to the front of the building. I want to tell you the truth about the morning the brass letters came down, because I think there's a version of this story people expect me to tell. The vindicated father, watching justice finally arrive, feeling something close to satisfaction as his son's empire crumbled brick by brick. That isn't what happened. I sat in my truck in the parking lot across the street for nearly 40 minutes after the workers finished, long after Otis had gone back inside to start the day's real work, and I cried in a way I had not cried since Marion's funeral 8 years earlier. I did not cry because I regretted anything I had done. I cried because grief and rightness are not opposites, and no one prepares you for how much they can occupy exactly the same hour of your life. I had spent 31 years building something with my own 2 hands, and I had just spent 11 weeks dismantling it with those same hands, and both of those things were true at once, and both of them hurt in ways that didn't cancel each other out, no matter how I tried to reason through it. Mostly, though, I cried for Dean. Not for the man who had stolen a blueprint or humiliated me in front of 50 strangers under crystal chandeliers. I had made a kind of peace with that man already, the way you make peace with a storm once it has passed through and you're left alone assessing the damage in the quiet after. I cried for the boy who used to stand in the doorway of my study in his socks, asking if he could help, who used to fall asleep in the passenger seat of my truck on the drive home from job sites with sawdust still in his hair. I sat in that truck and asked myself over and over where the distance between that boy and this man had opened up, and whether I was the one who had let it widen without noticing. Had I spent so many years teaching him to build safely that I forgot to teach him what to do when the ground under his own life started shifting? Had Marion's death, which hollowed both of us out in entirely different directions, hollowed him out in a way I mistook for ambition instead of what it actually was? Grief with nowhere left to go? I did not have an answer that morning. I still don't have a complete one, even now, writing this down. I only know that a father does not get to feel triumphant while asking himself these questions, no matter how justified his choices were, no matter how many people I'd saved by making them. Dean, meanwhile, was learning what it meant to lose everything that had never actually belonged to him in the first place. Within 2 weeks of the bankruptcy filing, his corporate credit cards were canceled without warning, the accounts simply frozen mid-swipe, I later learned, at a restaurant where he'd taken clients he no longer had. The mansion in Lake Forest, it turned out, had been financed against Whitfield Heritage stock he no longer controlled, and the bank foreclosed within the month. The same lift trucks that had once delivered his imported furniture now hauling it back out onto the lawn. His fiancée, a woman named Bianca I had met exactly twice, and like neither time for reasons I now understood far better than I had then, packed her belongings and left before the moving trucks, for the house had even finished loading. I heard about it secondhand, through Trevor, who still called me occasionally out of some sense of loyalty I hadn't earned and never asked for. The friends who had filled that ballroom, the private equity partners, and the real estate elite who had laughed along with Dean's toast that night, disappeared from his life with a speed that told me everything I needed to know about what those friendships had actually been built on. Not one of them called to check on him. Not one of them offered so much as a guest room or a loan or an honest word of comfort. Dean eventually moved into a one-bedroom apartment on the west side of the city, the kind of building he would once have described, without a trace of irony, as not our market. I know because I drove past it once, unable to help myself, and sat outside for a while, without going in. I did not go up to knock. I told myself it was because he needed to find his own way through this, without me standing over his shoulder the way I always had. And that was partly true. The other, harder part, the part I am only now able to admit, is that I did not yet trust myself to see him without saying something I would regret. Some version of I told you so dressed up as concern, which would have been its own quiet kind of cruelty. And my son had already absorbed enough cruelty for one season, even the kind he had earned. I understood, watching all of this unfold from a careful distance, that the harshest punishment life was handing my son had nothing to do with the money or the mansion or the friends who vanished the moment his name stopped opening doors. It was smaller than that, and crueler, and far more permanent. For the first time in his adult life, Dean woke up every single morning without a single external thing propping him up. No CEO title, no father's safety net quietly waiting behind him, no borrowed credibility from a name bolted to the front of a building. He was simply Dean, alone in a small apartment with second-hand furniture. And I think that was the first time in 32 years he had ever had to sit with exactly who that person was, without any scaffolding built up around him to hide the shape of it. I have built enough structures in my life to know that a building without scaffolding either stands on its own foundation or it doesn't stand at all. I did not know that long autumn which one my son was going to turn out to be. I spoke to almost no one about any of it that season except for Otis, who had known me long enough to sit with silence without filling it with advice I hadn't asked for. and a retired pastor named Reverend Cole, who I'd worked alongside years ago restoring a church sanctuary and had stayed friendly with ever since. I visited him one gray Sunday afternoon in November, not for counsel exactly, more because I needed to say the shape of my grief out loud to someone who wouldn't try to fix it for me. He listened for a long time, and then told me something I have carried with me since, that the hardest thing about loving someone through their own consequences is that love does not come with an exemption from watching them suffer. It only comes with the discipline not to rescue them from the lesson their suffering is trying to teach. I thought about that a great deal, driving home along the lake that evening, watching the gray water churn under a sky the same color. I thought about all the years I had rescued Dean from smaller consequences, without realizing what I was training him to expect, covering a fender bender in college so it wouldn't touch his insurance, smoothing over a client complaint early in his career so it wouldn't touch his record, handing him the CEO title before I was entirely certain he'd earn the judgment that should come with it. I did not build my son a foundation. Somewhere along the way, without meaning to, I had built him a series of soft landings, and I wondered now whether that was its own kind of structural failure, the sort that doesn't show itself until decades of load have already been resting on it. I did not reach out to Dean that winter, and he did not reach out to me. There were nights I sat at my kitchen table with my phone in my hand, his name pulled up on the screen, my thumb hovering over the call button for whole minutes at a time before I set the phone back down. I told myself I was giving him room. Some nights that was true. Other nights, if I'm honest, I was simply afraid of what I would hear on the other end, and whether I would have the strength to hear it without stepping in to fix it for him one more time. 2 years passed. I want to tell you they passed quickly, the way people say time does when you're older, but that would be a kindness to myself I don't think this story deserves. They pass slowly, one ordinary season at a time, the way real healing usually does, not in a single dramatic turn, but in 1,000 small mornings that eventually add up to something entirely different from where you started. Iron Bridge Restoration Collective, as the crew had voted to call it that first difficult winter, grew steadier than I ever let myself hope for out loud. Otis served as its first elected president, a role he took as seriously as any blueprint I'd ever handed him over 30 years of working together, and I stayed on as an advisor from a comfortable distance, invited to weigh in on the technical decisions that mattered, but no longer carrying the daily weight of running anything. I spent my mornings fishing on the lake near my cabin, something I had promised Marion I'd do more of, and never quite managed while I was still building an empire of my own that never left me a Saturday free. In the spring, I started giving occasional talks to engineering students and small business owners about worker ownership models, a subject I had backed into entirely by accident and come to believe in with the same conviction I once reserved for structural integrity alone. Ironbridge finished its second year with its first profitable quarter, dividends distributed not to a boardroom of strangers who had never held a trowel, but to the 36 families who had actually built the thing with their own hands. Dean's road looked nothing like mine. After the apartment on the west side, after months I only heard about secondhand. Through Trevor, he had taken a job, not in an office, not behind a desk, but as a site supervisor for a small commercial construction outfit 2 counties over, a company that had no idea and no particular interest in knowing that he had once run a firm 3 times its size. He wore a hard hat instead of a tailored suit. He stood in the rain checking rebar spacing the way I had taught him to as a boy on my own job sites. Except now he was doing it for $18 an hour, and nobody on that crew called him anything but Dean. No honorifics, no letterhead, just a name and a set of hands that either did the work correctly or didn't. I did not learn most of this from him. I learned it from Trevor, who still checked in on me from time to time, and later from Otis, who ran into one of Dean's coworkers at a supply house and mentioned, almost as an aside, that the new guy works harder than anybody twice his age, doesn't say much, doesn't complain, shows up early. I sat with that description for a long while after Otis told me. It did not sound like the son who had stood under crystal chandeliers and called me gutless in front of 50 strangers. It sounded like someone learning, the hard and only way most of us ever really learn anything worth knowing, what honest work actually costs and what it's actually worth when there's no name to hide behind. The letter came in October, 2 years almost to the week since that Thanksgiving. I recognized Dean's handwriting on the envelope before I opened it, and my hands were not entirely steady doing it. Inside was no request for money, no argument for reinstatement, no attempt to relitigate the bankruptcy or the cooperative or anything that had happened in that ballroom 2 years earlier. There was a single folded certificate, a basic safety management credential, the kind entry-level supervisors earn through night classes, and a proctored exam, nothing glamorous, the sort of thing I had earned myself 40 years earlier and barely thought twice about at the time. And beneath it, a handwritten letter, 3 pages long, in which my son finally wrote the sentence I had waited 2 years to read, that what he did was his own choice, made out of his own greed, and that he understood now, working $18 an hour shifts in the rain, exactly what he had thrown away and exactly why I hadn't handed it back to him the moment he asked. He did not ask me for anything in that letter. He asked only whether I would come to Thanksgiving, and whether, if it wasn't too much, he might come to mine instead. I stood on my porch that evening for a long time, letter in hand, watching the last of the daylight go out over the lake, and I let myself feel something I had been afraid to feel for 2 years. Cautious hope, the kind that doesn't erase the damage, but doesn't require you to keep carrying all of it forever either. The doorbell rang at 6 o'clock on Thanksgiving evening. I opened the door and found Dean standing on my porch in a coat that had clearly seen a few winters, holding a small box of pastries from a bakery 2 blocks from his apartment, bought, I knew without asking, on a modest paycheck instead of a corporate card he no longer had. He looked older than 34. He looked thinner and tired in the particular way honest labor tires a person, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he looked like someone standing on his own foundation instead of one he'd borrowed or stolen or built out of my name. I did not pull him into an embrace. I did not tell him the company was his again, because it wasn't, and it never would be. And some quiet part of both of us needed that, to stay true for whatever came next, to mean anything at all. I simply stepped back and opened the door wider. "That pie looks good," I said. "Come in, it's cold out there." He came in. We did not talk about Whitfield Heritage that night, or Ridgeline, or the ballroom, or any of it. We talked about the job he was working, a retaining wall giving his crew trouble on a slope with bad drainage, and I found myself, almost without meaning to, sketching a solution on a paper napkin the way I used to when he was young enough to still ask me questions, because he wanted the answer, not because he needed a favor. I think, looking back on everything that happened since that first Thanksgiving toast, that the greatest thing a parent can give a child is not protection. It is not a soft landing or a title or a name on a building that shields them from what their own choices would otherwise cost them. Sometimes the deepest form of love a father can offer is the privilege of falling, and the harder privilege of carrying the weight of that fall entirely on his own 2 feet. Forgiveness does not erase what came before it. It only opens a door, one you choose deliberately to leave unlocked, so that when someone finally finds their way back to it, honestly, under their own power, there is still somewhere waiting for them to come home to. Later that night, after the dishes were cleared and Dean had gone home to his small apartment with the last of the pie wrapped in foil, I sat alone on my porch the way I had 2 years earlier, with his letter in my hand. Except this time, there was nothing left to decide, nothing left to test. I thought about Marion and what she would have said watching her son walk back through that door in a second-hand coat instead of a tailored suit. I think she would have told me what I already knew, that we hadn't lost our son at that Thanksgiving table 2 years before. We had simply been waiting, the way you wait for concrete to cure, for him to become solid enough underneath to actually hold something again. Some foundations take longer than others to set. Ours, it turned out, took 2 years, a bankruptcy, a hard hat, and a box of pastries bought with an honest wage. But it held. And for a father who had spent his whole life reading structures for the smallest sign of failure, that was the one report I never stopped hoping I would someday get to write.